So just about every week that I get up here, and in the days leading up to this as I'm planning, preparing, studying, reading, I have a little bit of an internal struggle, a little bit of an internal tension. There's a voice inside my head that says, whatever you do, don't talk to them about running. And then there's another voice in my head that says, but running is so interesting. There are so many life lessons that we learn, so much theological application we can gather from running. And usually the first voice wins, usually, because I know that people hate listening to other people talk about running. And I understand that because runners are disgusting. Like the things we talk about with each other when we talk about running, like hang out with some runners and it will not take very long until they are talking about injuries. Because this is just a thing that happens. It's like an open secret. I don't even know if it's a secret in the running community. You run far enough or long enough, you will get injured. Like I remember one time I was talking with a friend of mine who I don't see very often, but he was in the area, and he had just started getting into running. A buddy of his had persuaded him to run a full distance marathon with him, even though he hadn't been running for well over a decade. Or maybe he'd never really run long distances before in his life, actually. And so he shared this with me. He's like, yeah, I'm training for this marathon, and I at the time was training for a half marathon. And so I thought he was pretty far into this and had a high comfort level with the sort of things that you experience as a runner. And so I looked at him and I said, have your toenails fallen off yet? And as the words were coming out of my mouth, I could see on his face, like I could kind of see on some of your faces, he was not ready for that conversation. Because he still had all his toenails. He wouldn't by the time it was over, but at that point in time, he did. But clearly, I did not learn my lesson then because I just told you that story. And even worse, I'm going to tell you about another running injury, actually one that I'm still dealing with. It's not as gross as toenails falling off, but it's actually a lot worse. Toenails aren't that important in life. Like, you don't need them. It's fine. It's not a big deal if they fall off. It's just a little bit gross. But what I'm dealing with is persistent chronic Achilles tendonitis. And it's not an acute injury. I didn't injure my Achilles. This is my right leg. I did injure my ankle, my left leg a couple times, but this is my right leg. And it's just an overuse injury. Like I use it too much, and the muscles, like where it inserts my Achilles from my calf into my heel, they just aren't working right, and they're sore all the time. And so I've been dealing with this for probably like 5-6 years, off and on. It's one of those injuries that's just kind of there. It's hard to deal with, hard to treat, never really fully goes away. Very, very annoying. And so I've tried different things to work at it. I saw a sports medicine doctor, and he's like, what we're going to try some nitroglycerin patches, and we're going to pop that right on the back of the Achilles, stimulate blood flow, see if that helps. It did not help, but it did make the life insurance adjuster very, very confused why somebody in their 30s was being prescribed nitroglycerin patches. That was a fun conversation to explain. And then we tried like a minor, not quite a surgical procedure, but kind of a surgical procedure where they go in with ultrasound and try to scrape away some scar tissue. Maybe that helped, but not a whole lot. And so I've been trying different things. And the doctor said, let's do another round of physical therapy. I tried physical therapy a while ago, but I went back just a couple weeks ago and started seeing a physical therapist. And I was expecting, because this is an injury to a major muscle group, that we would focus on major muscles. We would do things like single leg stances. We would do things like squats, just endless squats. And we did all of that, but then like my second or third session, the physical therapist takes me back to the space and says, okay, what I want you to do is I want you to have a seat on the table, set both your feet on the floor, take off your socks, shoes, both feet flat on the floor. And now what I want you to do is on your right foot, where you have this issue, I want you to just lift your big toe and put it back down. And I want you to do 15 reps. He called them reps. Lifting my big toe, a rep? Like, what is this dude talking about? Just sitting there, foot on the floor, toe up, toe down, toe up, toe down. And honestly, I was like, no, this is not a thing. This is not going to make a difference. And then he comes, he brings in a towel, he puts a towel under my foot, and he says, what I want you to do is using just your big toe, scrunch the towel back like this. Just move the towel across the floor with your toe. And do 15 reps, he calls them reps again, of that. And as if this all weren't bad enough, what he says to me is, he says, sometimes we call this toe yoga. And honestly, if I hadn't been so like desperate for pain relief, I would have just gotten up and walked out, because like this is nonsense. I do not have time to be sitting in an office paying good money for someone to tell me to lift my big toe up and down. I have like serious issues in my leg. I need serious treatment. But this is the thing. And the crazy part is that I think it might actually be helping. I can't be 100% sure. Like, I still have pain. It has not resolved it completely. But I think these dumb toe exercises, lifting and lowering this toe, scrunching a towel across the floor, I think this little exercise with my toe is actually helping my Achilles feel better. Last week, we looked at some major issues transpiring within our culture. Huge, seismic, but often subterranean shifts in the way we think about and experience life. Shifts that have tremendous impact on our lives of faith as followers of Jesus. We talked about the ways that in response to certain cultural changes, the Christian faith has become politicized, it's become highly sexualized, it's become digitized, all happening in an environment of rampant individualism. We, as the individuals, make all of our decisions for our own well-being. And this is happening, unfolding in a modernist worldview, a modernist frame of reference, where truth is understood to be those things that can be established through rational inquiry and observation through our senses. Tremendous, tremendous upheaval. And part of what it's led to is a rise in people rethinking their own faith commitments. In some cases, changing those faith commitments, in some cases, walking away from faith entirely. So we sort of looked at all of this last week, and I said, come back next week because we're going to talk about what we as people of faith can do in response. What should our response be as people who are trying to follow Jesus? Because at some level, all of us, if you're here in person or if you're worshiping online, all of us are interested in this question to some extent. Maybe you feel like your faith is just barely hanging on by a thread and you want to know, what can I do if I want to hold on to this? Or maybe you feel that your own faith is really stable and solid and secure, but there are those close to you who aren't as committed or invested in their faith. You wonder, what can I do for them? Or maybe you think about the big picture, the cultural landscape. What on earth can we as followers of Jesus do in the face of these cultural tsunamis that threaten to just overwhelm us? What can we do? Sometimes it feels like our culture, our world, our society has experienced a major injury, a significant trauma to some major muscle groups. And I worry that what I'm going to suggest is the course of faithfulness laid out for us in Scripture. The way that we respond as followers of Jesus to these massive cultural changes, I worry it's going to sound a little bit like being told to raise and lower your big toe. Surely this can't be sufficient. This can't be enough. This can't actually be the thing that we're called to. If the culture is experiencing a major injury, we need a major response. But what I believe we as followers of Jesus can do in this polarized moment, when it seems that many, many people no longer find their own Christian faith credible, I believe what we can do as followers of Jesus is that we can love one another deeply from the heart. That's how the Apostle Peter describes it. To love one another deeply from the heart. That in response to major cultural transition and upheaval and change, what can feel at times like significant threats to the foundations of Christian faith, what can seem like an acute, traumatic, major injury, what we can do as followers of Jesus is to persevere in loving those around us, loving God, and loving our neighbors. And if you're a bit skeptical of that, the way I was skeptical of this therapist who prescribed toe yoga to me, you are not alone. You are in good company. Well, maybe some good and some not so good company. We'll see. But there are plenty of people who have evaluated this claim that what we need to do as followers of Jesus is to love one another. That's the essence of who we are. There are plenty of people who have evaluated this claim and found it lacking. In the early 1970s, an influential theologian by the name of Stanley Hauerwas, who's actually been tremendously important in my own theological journey, he wrote an article for a theological journal entitled, "Love's Not All You Need." I think it may have been a reference to some obscure British rock band. I don't know. People tell me they're good. I've never really understood it, but it's neither here nor there. And what Hauerwas wrote in his article, "Love's Not All You Need," is if Christianity is primarily an ethic of love, I think that it is clearly wrong and ought to be given up. If Christianity is just about love, then it's wrong and it ought to be given up. And this is why. He says, our moral experience reveals that such an ethic is not sufficient to give form to our moral behavior. Love's not all you need because love cannot shape us, in Hauerwas's view at the time. Love cannot shape us to be deeply moral people who actually do good in the world. Love is insufficient. About 20 years later, an influential biblical scholar by the name of Richard Hays set out to summarize all of the ethical teaching of the New Testament. He wrote a book called The Moral Vision of the New Testament. It's still a tremendously influential text. And at one point, Hays actually follows Hauerwas. He cites Hauerwas in making a very similar point. Hays says love is insufficient to summarize the ethic of the New Testament because, in his view, the term love has become debased in popular discourse. It has lost its power of discrimination, having become a cover for all manner of vapid self-indulgence. Love doesn't do justice to the ethical vision of the New Testament because love in contemporary culture doesn't mean anything except do what you want and do what feels good and let others do what they want and what feels good. So influential, significant, serious Christian thinkers like Hauerwas and Hays look at this claim that love is sufficient, and they say, no, that's not actually the case. But we don't even have to turn to the academy or to serious theological inquiry. We can look at contemporary conversations that are happening. I heard someone this week, actually a politician, an elected congresswoman, and she's reflecting about the role of love within the Christian faith. She was asked by a Catholic activist, why is it that the Catholic Church is engaged in activities that feel to this activist to be political? Why is the Catholic Church doing things like helping migrants and working to resettle refugees? And I want you to listen to her response.
This is that Satan's controlling the church. The church is not doing its job. What they're doing by saying, oh, we have to love these people and take care of these migrants and love one another. This is loving one another. Yes, we are supposed to love one another, but their definition of what love one another means destroying our laws. The true meaning of loving one another and loving others means that you also have to uphold the law. You have to uphold the rules.
Love is insufficient as an ethic because it doesn't uphold the rules. We have to keep the laws. And I think it's fairly straightforward to see how illogical this approach is. It's pretty easy to see that this equates divine command with the laws of a temporal nation state. Like, it's pretty easy to look at this and see there's some fundamental misconceptions at play here. But I wonder if a more pertinent or challenging question might be for those of us who would have such a strong disagreement with the Congresswoman, who would hear someone say that and say she is completely and totally wrong about public policy, about Christian doctrine and theology. She is wrong. And I wonder for those of us who find ourselves in that position, whether we would believe that love is sufficient to the task at hand. Because here is someone who has formal governmental authority. They have power. They have societal influence, a following on social media. And they're advocating for things that to many of us would seem contrary to the teachings of Jesus, the example of the early church. And we don't have to single her out. There are plenty of people all around our culture that we would point to for various reasons, say they are wrong. They are missing something essential. Maybe they're not just wrong, but they're dangerous. And in those situations, when we feel that there's some sort of threat posed to people's well-being, do we believe that love is sufficient to the task at hand? Will love actually allow us to bring the transformation that we believe God desires into the world? Or do we agree with folks like Hays and Hauerwas that we need something different, something more, something better, something stronger, something more powerful than love? What I want to try to do briefly is sketch out for us perhaps a definition of love, because that's a lot of what we're struggling with. You heard it in the Congresswoman's remarks. She's disagreeing about the definition of love. And both Hauerwas and Hays, they are questioning the definition of love. So I want to sketch out a definition that I've found helpful, and then to think a little bit about the direction that Jesus left for us to follow. So to start with the definition. And we certainly don't help ourselves in English because we tend to be pretty sloppy in our language. And we have one word that we use for all manner of different experiences, right? It's a way you can respond to a friend's new hairstyle. Love it. But it's also the way you can describe the deepest bonds of connection in your life, the feelings you have toward your children. It's also a way we can describe physical intimacy. We use this one word to mean all sorts of different things, and we wonder why the definition gets a little bit watered down. So I found a definition from a theologian by the name of Thomas J. Oord, who's written a lot about love, and this is the way he describes it. He says, to love is to act intentionally, in relational response to God and others, to promote overall well-being. To love is to act intentionally, in relational response to God and others, to promote overall well-being. This is a really good definition, and I think it actually gets at how frequently the language and concepts of love show up in the New Testament, in the teachings of Jesus, in the writings of Jesus' first followers. It's not primarily talking about sentimentality. It's not even primarily talking about a feeling that we might have toward others. It's describing an orientation and a set of commitments that we have to act in right and proper ways relationally, responding to God's love for us, and then acting for the well-being of others. To act intentionally in relational response to God and others to promote overall well-being. Now, note that this does not answer all of the questions we might have about what it means to be a follower of Jesus in the world. We can have legitimate disagreements about what overall well-being requires and what moves us toward it. What are the conditions, the circumstances that move toward human flourishing? What are the things in Jesus' language that make for peace? It's not necessarily self-evident, but if we start from a place of love, an overall commitment, and a commitment to act intentionally in relational response to God and others to promote overall well-being. If we start there, it opens up avenues of conversation and exploration. That we can be in dialogue together as we are committed to one another in relationship. We can understand that we have different ideas of what overall well-being looks like and what it requires. We can be in dialogue and sustain that dialogue in healthy ways. I invite you to keep that definition in mind as we think about the direction that Jesus set out for us. It's an interesting question to think about. What did Jesus actually want his followers to do after he ascended into heaven? Jesus gives a commission to his disciples. We sometimes call it the Great Commission, to go into all nations or go into all the world and make disciples, followers of Jesus, teaching them to obey all that I have commanded and baptizing them. What does that look like? What does that mean? What does Jesus actually expect of us? I came across this claim from Henry Nouwen a couple of years ago, and I've reflected on it periodically from time to time, and I want to share it with you. This is what Nouwen says. Nouwen says that for Jesus, there are no countries to be conquered, no ideologies to be imposed, no people to be dominated. There are only children, women, and men to be loved. For Jesus, if we are following Jesus, Jesus is not concerned about conquering territory. Jesus is not concerned about imposing or protecting a certain ideology. Jesus is not concerned about dominating people, even if we're trying to dominate them so that they will do what we think is the right thing. What Jesus is concerned about is that we would love all of those that we encounter, children, women, and men, to be loved. And I've seen this quote, and maybe you have as well. I see it fly around on social media every now and then. And honestly, I have this negative, visceral response. I read it and I'm like, I don't know if Nouwen's right. I don't know if he's right. It doesn't really work that way. Is that sufficient to the task at hand? As we look at all of the brokenness and dysfunction in the world, is it really enough if we just make a commitment to act intentionally in relational response to God and others to promote overall well-being, is that really enough? Doesn't God expect more of us? What does love look like in action, Henry? If we really loved unborn children, wouldn't we do something to protect them? If we really loved black people and people of color, wouldn't we do something when we see them disproportionately victimized by police brutality? If we really loved those who are struggling in their faith, wouldn't we want to give them the truth, something firm and foundational to hold on to? Wouldn't we want to do something more if we really actually loved people? So I had to track down the source of this quote, because it sounded like one of those fluffy things that you say when you aren't really talking about something serious, when there aren't any real stakes involved, when nothing really matters all that much. You can say, yeah, the real important thing is that we just love one another. But then the rubber hits the road, things actually matter, and we think, no, actually we have to do something here. And so do you know what Nouwen was doing when he wrote this? He was writing a book near the tail end of the Cold War, talking about how Christians can respond to the threat of nuclear annihilation. I don't know that it gets more higher stakes than that, right? Confronting the idea of mutually assured destruction, that if things go south, we have enough weaponry to wipe out life on this earth many times over. It doesn't get more high stakes than that. And in the midst of thinking through the ethical implications of living at that moment in time, this is where Nouwen landed. There are no countries to be conquered, no ideologies to be imposed, no people to be dominated, only children, women, and men to be loved. And I wonder if maybe Nouwen got to this place of clarity by seeing the logic of mutually assured destruction. That if the only tool in our arsenal to respond to force is more force, there will be an ever-increasing escalation of force until all of humanity is destroyed. But what Nouwen saw is that Jesus laid out for us another way. That we don't have to be captive to the ever-escalating logic of destruction, mutual destruction, but that we can love one another. And finally, I think that brings us back to Ephesians. Because Ephesians gives us an idea of what it means to be a follower of Jesus in a Christian community. And there are times when the stakes are high. You actually have this reference, I don't know if you caught it when Sam was reading, but this reference to the devil, or evil personified. The author of Ephesians understands that there is something difficult happening in the world. They understand that the world sometimes feels like a site of conflict, maybe even existential threat. There is a very real adversary out there, and the author of Ephesians is worried about it. It says there's something that you can do to not leave room, or some translations would say leave a foothold, or I might say leave a toehold for the devil. And you would think this is when strength matters. This is when it matters to be tough and strong and confident and dominant. What the author of Ephesians says is this: do not let the sun go down on your anger. That is the faithful Christian response. When faced with existential threat and danger, the Christian response is to continually, later in the verse we see, to be continually forgiving, putting away all bitterness and wrath and anger and wrangling and slander and all malice, and instead being kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ has forgiven you. And we put a chapter break in there, but the train of thought actually continues in chapter 5, verse 1, where the author writes, therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and live in love, as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. I believe that love, rightly understood, is the faithful Christian response in a time of intense societal upheaval, In a time when Christianity seems to be suffering in many ways, to have experienced this acute major muscle injury, in a time of intense increasing polarization, when it feels like the stakes are incredibly high, I believe the only faithful Christian response is to live in love with one another. And that this is what God has called us to be tender-hearted and forgiving one another, and living in right relationships, seeking mutual well-being. And when it seems that we're under attack or under threat and we want to be strong and tough, the invitation of Christ in our life is to be tender-hearted and forgiving, to love. Far be it for me to disagree with great thinkers like Stanley Hauerwas and Richard Hayes, but in this case I will disagree. But I think even they would come around and acknowledge that if we can get the understanding of love right definitionally, love does in fact summarize and capture the New Testament's teaching. Love is the thing that allows us to be faithful to God in the midst of tremendous difficulty and challenge. We tend to think of love as this sort of soft thing, weak, not super effective. But in reality, it is the demonstration of God's power, is the life of Jesus lived in loving relationship with his disciples for the love that God has through Christ for the world, ultimately culminating in Jesus' loving giving of himself. This is the truth of God's power. Today, as I'm sure some of you know, and if you don't, this is a public service announcement. Today is Mother's Day. And I know that can be a complicated day for some of us, those who want to be mothers and aren't, those who are mothers and sometimes wonder if they really actually wanted to be, those who don't feel good enough as mothers, those who have complicated relationships with their own mothers. Lot of complexity there, and I get that. And some of that complexity comes because the understanding of Mother's Day has actually shifted over time to become this thing that it is today, which is primarily about sentimentality and appreciation, which there's a place for that, absolutely the appreciation part. But the first initial call to a Mother's Day celebration actually came from a feminist thinker in the 1870s named Julia Ward Howe. You might know her best-known work, The Battle Hymn of the Republic. And after surveying the atrocities of the American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War, Julia Ward Howe had had enough. And so she issued a call for an international women's convention, or an international women's congress, for women to come together and say, enough. And this is what she wrote in her call for this. She says, "Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We, women of one country, will be too tender to those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs." I believe the call that Julia Ward Howe issued to women is remarkably similar to the call that Jesus of Nazareth issues to all of us. That whatever the perceived dangers or challenges that we face, we as followers of Jesus, as people of God, will be entirely too tender-hearted to allow ourselves to injure others. The faithful Christian response doesn't look like much. It looks like lifting and lowering that big toe. How on earth is this going to make a difference? If I love someone else, is that really going to make any difference in the grand scheme of things? And the Christian answer, the answer of Jesus, is it is the only thing that will actually make a meaningful, lasting difference as we commit to loving one another deeply from the heart. Would you pray with me? Gracious and merciful God, we give you thanks for your faithfulness to us through Christ, for the love that you had for this world and for us that you demonstrated through Christ, who taught us how to love one another well. God, we admit that this time of societal change and upheaval we are living through can feel overwhelming and dangerous and threatening. We want to protect what we feel is ours. We want to be safe. We want to be secure. And God, we know these are not wrong-hearted desires, but we sometimes pursue them in the wrong way. And so we confess that, God, and pray that you would, by the mercies of your Holy Spirit, give us hearts that are tender toward those around us. Even in the midst of our disagreements, our arguments, that we would affirm with Christ that love is in fact enough. And we pray all of this in the precious name of Christ. Amen.